Welcome back. This is the next video in our series, How to Build an API with Node.js. If you have not watched the previous video, I highly recommend that you go back and watch it. I will link it on the screen. Each video builds upon the previous one. In our last video, we set up a simple API using Node.js, and we were testing it using Postman. However, in Postman, you can't really see what a route is expecting to receive in the body or in the parameters. So today, we're going to be setting up Swagger documentation. So this will document our code, and it will set up a UI that shows what a route is expecting and lets us make calls to the route, just as we would with Postman. If you would like to look at the documentation, you can find it here at https://swagger.io specification. To get started today, we're going to need to install Swagger UI Express and Swagger JS Doc. These are the npm packages that will allow us to actually document our code and create that UI. So first we're going to pull up our terminal, and we are going to run npm I swagger-ui-express and swagger-js doc. So once these install, then we can close our terminal. Up here, we are going to import them. So const swagger UI equals require swagger UI express, and the same for swagger JS doc. Require swagger JS doc. So now we need to define some options for our Swagger docs to listen to. So const options, and these will be the identifying information for the Swagger documentation, as well as what the URL is. So we have a definition object that specifies to use the 3.0.0 version of Swagger. Info, this will be our meta info about what the Swagger documentation is for. So title is the name of the API, so in our case to-do list API, and the version of the API, in our case it's 1. And then we need to specify what servers are these for. So what URL is this available on? So servers, it's a array of objects that match this format. Take a URL. This is what the Swagger this is the base URL for the Swagger documentation. So HTTP, in our case, we are running on localhost, and we are going to pass in the port env variable that we used last time. That's what the API is running on. And we are going to add a small description, and we're just going to say this is for the to-do list API documentation. Finally, in this configuration object, we are going to specify the relative route at which the documentation exists, and this will be in the format of comments. So we're going to grab the documentation from our routes folder in each of the JS files. So this is just saying, hey, go to the routes folder and grab the comments from every single file in there that matches a JS extension. Next, we need to utilize these options. So const specifications or specs equals, and this is where Swagger JS doc comes into play, because this is what is generating the documentation from the comments. And now we need to tell our application or API to utilize the specs and build a UI from them. It's going to be hosted and available at localhost, in our case port 3001, at the endpoint API-docs. We want to serve this so that it's available for users to access, and we need to set up the UI for it based on the specifications that we just created. And that takes care of the initial setup in the server.js. So if we pull up our terminal again, and now we run this, npm start, we'll see that it is now running on port 3001. And we can see that now if we're at localhost 3001/API-docs, we can see our Swagger UI. So currently this is empty because we don't have the routes documented with comments. But you can see here, to-do list API, which we specified, version 1.0.0, and using the Open API version 3. We have our server list here. In our case, it's just the localhost 3001 with the description to-do list API documentation. So let's come back over to our code and specify the documentation for each of our routes. So we'll come into our to-do list.js file, and if you remember last time, we set up a get, a post, a put, and a delete. So currently there's no way to tell what the information is that it's expecting and what the information is that you're expecting to receive back from it. So we're going to come up near the top, and we are going to first off define what the expected responses look like. So we open up this piece of this comment. It's just a multi-line comment, and we start out by basically alerting Swagger that this is relevant to it. We are creating a list of definitions. So these definitions will be referenceable later on with our Swagger documentation for each of the routes. So our first definition is going to be an entry, and if you notice here, I have 2 spaces. So this is a significant white space application, which means that, like, if I had it indented 1 space, it would break. If I had it indented 3 spaces, it would break. But if I have it indented 2 spaces, it works correctly. So remember to always be indented 2 spaces for every level that you're down. So the first level is 2 spaces, the second level is 4 spaces, and so on. So for our entry, we want to define what type it is, and in this case it will be an object. And then what are the properties that we can expect to see in these objects. So the first one is an ID, and this will be of type integer. The next one is a title, and this will be of type string. And lastly, we have a due date, and in this case it is type string as well. Next, we're going to define our error object. So this will be the object that is returned if a call was made incorrectly or if something went wrong in our routes. So error type object, and the properties are going to be error. This will also be type object with properties status, which is type integer, and message, which is type string. And that takes care of our definitions for this project. So entry and error. The first route that we're going to document is going to be our get entries route. So we come down here just above get entries. We open up our multi-line comment again. Alert Swagger that this is a relevant comment. And we're going to now specify which route this is. So it's going to be this exact same endpoint. So to-do list entries with a colon, and then get is the method that this route uses. A list of tags, which this allows grouping of routes in the UI, which I'll show you in a minute. So for this, we're going to enter to-do list, and I'm basing that off of the fact that all of these begin with to-do list, so they are to-do list routes. Make a description for this route, and this just returns all entries. And we want to specify the responses that a user can expect from this route. So a 200, this is the status code. So 200 is a good response. The description of this, we're going to make array of entries. The content that the user can expect is of type application JSON. And the format in which they can expect this is, which another word for that is schema, is type array. And the items of the array will match the entry definition that we defined earlier. So the items reference this definitions / entry object. So that will be this properties of ID, title, and due date. Next, I want to specify what happens when there's a 404. So if there are no entries, then the user should expect to receive back a no entries found error. The content will match the shape of application JSON, and it will be the schema of our error definition. So again, root definitions error. and that takes care of defining the get route. Now that we have our definition written, in order to get this no entries found 404, we need to actually add it to our route definition. So within this try catch, we are going to specify that if the to-do list entries dot length equals 0, that means that there are no entries. So we want to throw a status 404 with a message of no entries found. This will let the user know that there are currently no entries in our to-do list. So if we come back over to our localhost 3001 API docs and we hit refresh, now you can see we have this to-do list group that is collapsible or expandable. We have our get route at to-do list entries, and we expand it. We see it returns all entries. Okay, it takes no parameters. That's correct. And we can expect these following status codes. So 200, a good response, array of entries. And we can expect the format of the return to match this array of entry objects. And then likewise for a 404 where there are no entries found, we can expect it to match this error format, which is just an object with an error object and then a status and a message. So up here, you might notice that there is a try it out button. If we click on that, it brings up this extra button that says execute. If we hit execute, it should bring back our, well, right now it's an empty array because we haven't actually added any entries. So we should expect to receive back an error with a status of 404, and it should say no entries found. So we hit execute, and yep, we get back a 404 with an error of no entries found. Next, let's define our post route. So we come in here, we have our post route here. We open our multi-line comment. We alert Swagger that this is a applicable comment. We specify our endpoint, to-do list entries. We specify our method, which is post. We assign it a tag, in this case to-do list, so that it is part of the to-do list grouping of routes in our UI. We write a small description about the route, so create new entries. And since a post can accept a body, this requires a bit more setup. So we're going to specify the structure expected for our request body. This is required, so we are making it required to send a body. The content of the body is application JSON. It matches the schema of type object, so our body will be an object. It has the following properties. So properties entries, so this will be an array with items that match the following form. So they will be of type object. They will have the properties of title, and a title is type string expected, and this will be required. So each entry in our to-do list is required to have a title. They are also required to have a due date, and this will be of type string as well, and we will specify that it is required. Next, we want to specify what the user can expect the return to look like. So if we come here, responses, 200 with a description of array of newly created entries, because our route returns the newly created entries, and what the user can expect to receive back is JSON that matches the following schema. So it'll be an array, and each item in the array will match our entry definition that we specified earlier. So once again, we access our definitions and our entry. So if you remember, our entry looks like an integer ID, a string title, and a string due date. Lastly, we want to let the user know if they made an incorrect request. So maybe they left out a piece of information, like they didn't include a title on their objects, or they didn't even send a body. So this will be a 404, which is a bad request. So bad request. And the content, much like with the get for the 404, it will be application JSON matching the schema of our error object. So ref hashtag definitions error, and that takes care of the post route. So if we come back to our Swagger UI, scroll back to the top, and let's collapse this. We hit refresh. Now we see that we have our post route accessible. Expand it. Now you can see we have this example request body here. So we can see that it is expecting a object that has an array of entries, and each entry needs to have a title and a due date. If we come over here to this schema link, you can see that it shows this in a more JSON formatted friendly option. It shows you the definition, so the title is a string, due date is a string, and these are both required true. If we go back to the example value, you can see that it doesn't state that these values are required. So once again, we have our status of 200 expected, and that's the array of newly created entries, and we have our status of 400, or a bad request, expected as well, and that returns an error with a status and a message. So if we come up to try it out, and then we enter some information like date with wife, and I'm going to say that this is on 8/4, so August 4th, 2022 at 11 p.m. Also, note that hitting tab in here doesn't work as expected. It'll actually bring you to the next button or input. So I'm going to add another one, that is a title of take out trash, and a due date of 8/6/2022 at 6 a.m. let's say. And don't forget to close with a curly brace. So now if we hit execute, we should see that it sends back our newly created entries. So we'll be looking for this date with wife and then take out trash, and they should both have an ID. So if I hit execute and I come down here, once again you can see what was actually sent to our API. And in our 200 you can see that we have our two entries, date with wife and take out trash, and they now have IDs, which means that they're stored. So if we come back up to our get, try it out, and execute, you can see now that it returned our two entries. If you are finding this video helpful, please remember to leave a like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think about this. Next, let's define our put route. So we come down to just above our put, we open our multi-line comment, alert Swagger that this is applicable to it, our to-do list entries route, and this will take in a parameter with the name ID. So instead of using this colon and then the parameter name format, Swagger utilizes curly braces with the name of the parameter inside of it. And this is a put belonging to the to-do list group, so the tags. The description of this route is update a specific entry. So this will be the entry that we specify by ID. And because this takes an ID parameter, we have to specify what the parameter is. So we have our parameters, and there's 3 A's. That's actually an E. I used to be good at spelling. Parameters, and it will be located in the URL path. So we call it path in Swagger. So in the path, name is ID, and the description of the ID is an ID of an existing entry, so that the user knows what this ID correlates to. The schema of the ID is type integer, and it is required, because if the user doesn't specify the ID of the entry that they want to update, then we have no idea what to actually update. So puts also allow request bodies. So we're going to create the request body definition. This will be required as well. It will be application JSON, and the schema will match the following. So it will be type object, and the properties that we can expect are data. So our body will have a data object, so type object, and the properties on this data object are title, which is a string, and a due date, which is also type string. So in our post route, we also accepted title and due date as strings, but we made them required. So while that is necessary for creating an entry, when updating an entry, we want to allow the user to have the freedom to update either title or due date, or update both simultaneously. So we leave off the required true, and it defaults to optional. And this gives our user more flexibility. So next, we are going to specify the responses. So we come over here, responses, and this will be a 200. And what the user can expect to receive back is an array with the updated entry. Content will be application JSON. And the response will match the format of an array with items matching our entry definition. Definitions/entry. And lastly, for this route, we will specify the 400 response. So 400 description, bad request again. Content will be application JSON, and it will match our error definition. So ref definitions error. So if the user sends a bad request, so like if the user sends an ID that doesn't exist, then they will receive back an error. And we're actually going to add handling for that right now. So in our try catch, we will below our ID parameter parsing, we will look through our to-do list entries. So if we don't find to-do list entries where the ID is, so this will be entry where the ID of the entry does equals the ID that was specified. So we loop through our to-do list entries, and we're looking for an entry with an ID that matches the ID that was sent. So if that returns undefined, that is a falsy value. So then we want to throw an object, so an error, that has a status of 404 and 400, and a message stating specified entry does not exist, letting the user know that they've tried to update an entry that doesn't exist. If we come back over to our Swagger documentation, we close it, refresh the page, we now have the put route. So if you remember, currently, because our API refreshed when we saved, thanks to nodemon, we actually have to recreate some entries. So I am going to create date with wife, and this will be on 8/4/2022. So I will just create the one. So our entry list currently has one entry that has date with wife on 8/4/2022. I'm going to come into my put. I'm going to try it out, specify that I want to update the first entry, and in data I want to I forgot to put a time on that entry. So I remove the title because I don't want to update that because that is correct. So due date, and I am going to for at 2022 at 11 p.m. And I'm going to hit execute. And it looks like we have a little significant white space error in our code, or in our comment for our Swagger definition. So we're back in our code. Let's see where this error is. So we have our request body correct. We have our responses lined up. We have our 2 responses here lined up. We have these 4 pieces lined up. We have here it is. So these 2, so starting here, the schema piece, since it is a child of the application JSON, we need to indent it. So what I'm going to do is, in VS Code you can use Control D to highlight and ultimately select the next occurrence, and keep doing that through all the occurrences in a file. So I'm going to indent these 2. If I come back into my Swagger documentation and I hit refresh, we should now, we now see the responses at the bottom. Lastly, we're going to create our delete route definition. So we come back down here to our delete route. We open up our multi-line comment. We specify that Swagger should listen to this comment. Our to-do list entries, and this takes in an ID parameter again. Our method is delete. It belongs to the to-do list group of routes. And what this route does is delete a specific entry. So it will delete the specified entry that you've declared with the ID parameter. Parameters, again, located in the path. The name of the parameter is ID. The ID correlates to an existing entry, so it's ID of an existing entry. And the schema is type integer, and it is required again. Again, we don't want the user trying to delete everything. It's just supposed to be a specific entry. So this doesn't take any body. I believe a delete allows a body, but in this specific case we are not utilizing the body. So we just want to create our responses for this. So for 200, user can expect back an array with the remaining entries. So in this case, it'll either be whatever entries are remaining, or it'll be a 404 as we specified in the get. So an array, and the content will be application JSON, as with the others. And the schema will be an array with items matching the same structure as our entry definition. So once again, reference the entry definition, so definition/entry, and that takes care of the 400. The 200. So now we need to specify the 400. Description, bad request. So this could either be that the ID doesn't exist, or technically that's the same thing as no entries remaining, but for this the user can expect back our error object. So application JSON schema and reference our error definition. That takes care of the Swagger definition. Now in our actual route, we are going to throw if there are no entries remaining after this. So if to-do list entries dot length equals 0, and here we are filtering out all the IDs or all the entries that match this ID that was sent, and we are not going to actually do a check for if the ID exists because above what is required here, because in this particular case it doesn't really matter, because it's just filtering out whatever entries have the ID that was sent, and if there aren't any, then it will just it'll just not really affect the array. So, but here we want to alert the user if there are no entries remaining after the deletion. So if to-do list entries dot length equals 0, we want to throw a status 404 actually, and we are going to up here specify the 404, and since it's the same as the 400, I'll just copy paste. So 404, and this will be no entries remain. So 404 message no entries remain. And that takes care of the delete route definition. We again come back over to our Swagger UI, scroll back up to the top, collapse that, and refresh. We now see that we have the delete. It looks like we have another error in our Swagger definition. So we come back over to our code, and let's see. Our 4 responses are lined up correctly. Oh, and I already see the issue. Once again, the schema in these 2 blocks are not indented. So what we're going to do is select the different pieces. So I will do this, boom, and boom. So now that those are updated, we come back over to our Swagger UI, refresh, and now the Swagger definition is loading correctly. So we currently have no entries, so we're going to create one real quick. I'm just going to use the default title and due date. So now we have our 1 entry with ID 1, and I'm going to make a couple of these. Execute, execute, execute. And so now we should have 4 entries. Come to the get route, execute. You can see that we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's good. I'm going to collapse these, come back to our delete, and I am going to remove the third entry. So I specify that I want to remove ID 3, and if I hit execute, now you can see that we only have 1, 2, and 4. If I come back up to the get, we should see the same thing, 1, 2, and 4. And then just to test that our error is working correctly, I'm going to remove the rest of them. So 1, 2, and 4. And now you can see we have no entries remaining. Hopefully you found this video interesting and helpful, and as always, thank you for watching.